Hello, my friends. Thank you for sitting with me again today. If you're new here, I welcome you. This little corner is where we share stories about family, about love, and sometimes about the heartbreak that teaches us more than joy ever could. If you find meaning here, I hope you'll stay subscribed and join this circle. Now, let me tell you a story that carries a lesson I will never forget. The title is They Turned My Wife's Photo Face Down. I Turned the Will Upside Down. It began quietly in the living room of my own house. I had placed a small wooden table near the window where the morning sun slanted in soft gold. On it stood a frame, my wife's photo. Silver edges worn smooth from years of my touch, her smile captured in the light of a summer afternoon long gone. She had been gone from this world for years, but her presence still filled the house. That morning I had polished the glass gently, the way one wipes the dust off a memory. My hands, rough from a lifetime of work, lingered on the frame. I set it upright straight, as though she were sitting in the room with me, watching over her family. Then footsteps broke the silence. My daughter-in-law entered, heels clicking sharp against the floor. She glanced at the photo with the kind of cold look that does not belong in a family home. Without a pause, she muttered, "We don't need this photo staring at us." And before I could speak, she reached out and turned the frame face down. The sound was soft, a faint thud of wood against wood, but it struck me louder than thunder. In that moment, the room felt smaller, darker. My chest tightened as though the years of sacrifice, of love, of memory had been shoved aside with a single motion. Right there in the heart of my own living room, the photo of my wife, my companion, the mother of my children, lay hidden face down, as if her life had no place left among us. It was not just a gesture. It was a line crossed, a wound carved deep, a kind of disrespect that doesn't shout but cuts silently straight through a man's bones. And I stood there frozen, realizing that this was not only about a photo. It was about the place of respect in a family, and what happens when that respect is lost. The house we stood in was not just walls and beams, it was built out of my years. I remembered laying its foundation with calloused palms, carrying lumber on my shoulders, while neighbors came by with cold water in jars. My wife had chosen the paint, a warm shade of cream that made the place glow even in winter. Each corner bore a trace of us, the tiny pencil marks on the kitchen wall where we had measured our children's growth, the dent on the stair rail from when my son had tripped carrying his football helmet, the faint scent of lavender my wife used to keep in her dresser drawers. And now to see her photo turned face down here, it felt as though every nail I had hammered, every board I had cut, had been dismissed with a shrug. I looked at the photo lying flat on the table. For a second my hand trembled, wanting to reach for it, to lift it back upright. But the air was heavy with eyes watching me, waiting to see what I would do. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms. Her tone was casual, but the sting was sharp. You keep holding on to the past. It makes the house feel old. We need a modern space, not a shrine. Her words echoed in my ears louder than they should have been. A shrine, that frame was not a shrine. It was a reminder, a thread that bound our family to the woman who had loved it into being. Without her, there would be no son, no grandchildren, no home for them to stand in. I swallowed hard, staring at the wooden floor beneath me. It creaked slightly, the same floorboards I had laid down more than 30 years ago, their varnish dulled by time and footsteps. My daughter-in-law saw only age, but I saw stories embedded in those grains of wood. I saw my wife's bare feet padding across it, carrying breakfast plates to the table. I saw my children crawling there, laughter echoing in the walls. And yet in this moment it was clear to her none of it mattered. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay silent. But inside the silence was loud, a silence that carried the weight of a man who has given everything only to find his history treated as clutter. The photo stayed face down. And so, for the first time in my own home, I felt like a guest. The evening light slipped through the curtains, casting long shadows that stretched across the living room floor, as though even the house itself felt uneasy. The photo still lay face down, its silence, more painful than any shouted word. I thought the moment would pass, that respect would return to the air if I let it settle. But instead, the silence cracked. My daughter entered, her heels clicking sharp against the floorboards. She glanced at the frame, then at me, and her lips curled into something that was neither smile nor frown. It was dismissal. Dad, you need to understand, she said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. Holding onto her picture, holding onto her things. It's not helping anyone. What we need is support. Real support. Money. That's how a father proves himself now. The words sliced through me. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. Money I had worked my whole life so they could stand in this house, go to school, eat at a table that never went empty. I had carried their futures in the sweat of my back and the ache of my bones. Was that not support? Was that not enough? My hand brushed against the armrest of the old wooden chair, where my wife once sat sewing. The fabric was worn smooth from years of use, and in that small texture I felt her presence again. She had always reminded me, Mac's love is the roof over this house, not the shingles. And yet here I was, being told that without dollars in my hands I was not a father at all. I looked at my daughter, the child I had once carried on my shoulders through county fairs, the same girl who used to cling to my leg when thunderstorms rattled the windows. Her eyes were colder now, fixed on the thought of accounts and bills. I wanted to speak, to remind her of the nights I stayed awake by her sickbed, the mornings I went without so she could have. But when I opened my mouth, no words came. Only the sound of the clock ticked steady, merciless. I reached for the frame on the table, lifting it back upright with hands that shook more from grief than age. I set it firm, meeting their eyes. For the first time, my voice broke the silence, low and rough. If money is the only father you see, then you've already lost the one you had. The room froze. My daughter blinked, her jaw tight, while my daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably, arms still folded. In that pause, I felt both the echo of all my sacrifices and the sharp break of betrayal. And the photo or photos stood once more watching over us. That night the house did not sleep. I heard the faint scrape of slippers across the hallway, the low murmur of voices behind a closed door. Their whispers carried through the thin walls like smoke curling under a doorway impossible to ignore. He's stuck in the past. My daughter's voice floated out sharper than the cold wind that rattled the shutters. We can't live on his memories. We need what's left of his money before it's gone. Her words hit harder because I remembered another night years ago when she whispered to her mother in that same hushed tone. Don't tell Dad I broke the vase. He works too hard already. That was the echo, then love, now calculation. I leaned against the hallway wall, the wood pressing into my back, listening. My daughter-in-law's voice joined, hushed but cutting. If he keeps wasting what little he has, there'll be nothing for us. We should convince him to sign things over now while he's still reasonable. The word reasonable lodged like a stone in my chest. To them I was a ledger to be balanced, not a man who once patched their roofs in the rain or drove hours in that old truck to fetch medicine. I wanted to break into the room, to shatter the whispers with the truth of every scar I carried for them. But I stayed silent because sometimes silence burns deeper than shouting. The floorboards creaked beneath me, a sound that betrayed my presence. The whispers stopped. A door opened slowly, and my daughter appeared in the dim light. Her face shifted between guilt and defiance like a candle flickering in a draft. Dad, you shouldn't be listening, she said, her tone clipped, almost rehearsed. I met her eyes, and for the first time I let the weight of my hurt show without disguise. I don't have to listen, I answered, my voice trembling but clear. The house itself tells me everything. Behind her, I caught a glimpse of my daughter-in-law, arms, crossed lips pressed tight. The air smelled faintly of reheated leftovers, but beneath it lingered something sour disrespect so strong it stained the walls. I turned away before they could answer, retreating to the living room. There, under the watchful gaze of my wife's photo, I sat in her old chair. My hands pressed against the worn armrests, grounding me as the clock's steady rhythm filled the silence. For every whisper behind their doors, there was an echo in my heart the nights I worked double shifts so they'd never feel hunger, the mornings I left early so they could sleep warm. Sacrifice had been my language. Now betrayal was theirs. And the frame on the table, standing tall once more, bore silent witness. Morning light broke through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the living room floor, where I had dozed in my wife's chair. The smell of cold ashes from the fireplace lingered mixed with faint traces of the perfume my daughter-in-law had left behind in the hall. The house felt like a shell room filled with voices, but empty of kindness. I stepped outside, needing air. The frost on the grass crunched under my boots, sharp and brittle, echoing the state of my chest. Across the fence, Mrs. Whitaker, the neighbor who had lived beside us for decades, was tugging at her mailbox. She saw me and froze, her eyes softening. "Max," she called gently, her voice carrying over the fence like a warm quilt on a cold day. "I heard last night. The voices. You don't deserve that." Her words cracked the stillness, and I turned slowly, ashamed that even the walls had not been able to keep my family's disrespect hidden. For a moment I wanted to brush it off, to pretend it was nothing. But her gaze pressed into me, kind but unrelenting, and I could not lie. "They think I'm just holding on to memories," I said, my voice low, rough as gravel. "They think the photo, the old truck, the bills I've carried, none of it means anything anymore. That without money, I am nothing." Mrs. Whitaker shook her head, lips trembling with restrained anger. "Don't let them erase you, Max. I remember the man who carried groceries for me after my surgery. The man who fixed my fence without asking for a dime. Money never defined you. Sacrifice did. Love did." Her words struck like an echo from a better time, breaking through the heavy fog in my chest. And yet the break came too, the reminder that my own blood could not see what a neighbor still held clear. From her porch, her dog barked, the sound sharp against the frosty air. Inside my house I could hear faint movement, dishes clinking, voices muttering. The two worlds collided, one of recognition, one of rejection. I tightened my grip on the fence post, the wood damp and cold beneath my palm. "They turned her picture face down," I whispered, the confession escaping before I could swallow it. As if her eyes, even in a frame, were an intrusion. Mrs. Whitaker's hand flew to her chest, and for a moment her silence said more than words ever could. Her eyes glistened, and she nodded once slowly, as if marking down in her heart the betrayal she had just heard. Behind me, a door opened, and my daughter's voice, too bright, too rehearsed, floated out. "Dad, come inside. It's cold. You'll catch something." I did not move. The frost bit at my fingers, the fence steady under my hand, the neighbor's eyes steady on my face. Between the warmth of recognition and the chill of betrayal, I stood suspended, knowing the house behind me was no longer home, but a courtroom waiting for its trial. And in that silent yard under the pale morning sun, the verdict had already begun to form. The neighbor's words still clung to me as I stepped back into the house. The warmth inside felt false, like a stage lit too bright. The dining table stood half-set silverware laid with a clatter too loud for the quiet that had fallen between us. My daughter-in-law moved quickly, her hands arranging plates, as if nothing had happened the night before. But I could feel the weight of the picture frame still lying face down on the mantel, its absence louder than any voice. I pulled out a chair, the wood groaning beneath me, and sat with my hands folded. My daughter came in from the kitchen, wiping her palms on a towel. She didn't meet my eyes. Instead, she spoke to the room itself, to no one in particular. "We don't need the past watching over every meal. It's better this way. Cleaner." The words were daggers wrapped in softness. Cleaner. As if love was dust. As if memory was dirt. I stared at the empty plate before me, its porcelain surface reflecting the ceiling lamp, and I wondered when my family had begun to see me as clutter too. The clinking of glasses filled the silence, echoing and breaking it apart in uneven beats. My grandson, small and quiet, slipped into the chair beside me. His hand brushed against mine under the table, warm and trembling. He didn't speak, but the touch said what the others would not, that someone still saw me, still remembered. I turned slightly, catching the faintest smile in his eyes before he lowered them to his plate. It was like a candle flickering in a storm, fragile but real. Around us, the voices of the younger ones rose in casual talk, work deadlines, new phones, plans for the weekend, none of it tethered to the man at the head of the table or the woman whose picture lay hidden. I lifted my fork but found I could not eat. The smell of roasted meat filled the room, heavy and rich, yet it turned in my throat like ash. My wife had once seasoned meals with laughter. Now the food tasted of indifference. A chair scraped against the floor. My son leaned back, his tone dismissive. Dad, you should think about downsizing. The house, the truck, all of it's just too much for you now. Too much. The phrase hung over the table like smoke. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth, tracing the worn stitches with my eyes. It was the cloth my wife had chosen, the one she had folded and refolded, for decades, her hands weaving care into every crease. Now it was just fabric to them, another relic to discard. The fork slipped from my grip, clattering against the plate. Every head turned for a second, then turned back as if the sound meant nothing. Only my grandson's eyes stayed fixed on me, wide and shining. In that look, I felt the bridge between betrayal and memory, between the family that had forgotten and the child who still held on. The table was silent again, but the silence no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the verdict forming in my chest, quiet yet unstoppable, waiting for the day it would be spoken aloud. The night stretched long after that dinner. I could hear the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, each strike louder in the emptiness of the house. The frame was still turned down on the mantel, a flat silence where once her smile had lived. I stood there for a long time, the lamp casting a thin shadow across the wooden floor. My hand trembled as I reached for the photo, but I didn't lift it. I wanted them to see it first. I wanted the silence to accuse them. Morning came with pale light streaming through the curtains. The smell of coffee rose from the kitchen, sharp and bitter. I walked in and found my daughter-in-law already at the counter, her back turned, pouring cups as if routine erased the night before. My son entered, scrolling through his phone. They spoke over each other, voices filled with errands and schedules, none of them carrying her name. Then my grandson slipped in quietly, holding a small toy truck in his hand. He placed it on the table near me, whispering, "Grandma liked when you fix things. She told me once." His words were soft, but they cracked through the noise. My eyes burned, though no one else seemed to notice. The moment broke when my daughter-in-law looked over, her tone sharp. "Dad, don't bring that picture out again. It makes the room feel heavy." She sipped her coffee, not even meeting my gaze. My son nodded faintly, a silent agreement that weighed heavier than words. Something inside me shifted then. The chair beneath me creaked as I leaned forward. The toy truck glinted under the morning light, its chipped paint echoing the old truck parked outside, both relics, both mocked. I felt the circle closing in my wife's photo, my son's dismissals, the grandson's fragile loyalty. I rose without a word, walked to the mantel, and lifted the frame. My reflection caught in the glass, tired eyes, overlaid with her younger smile. I held it upright again, letting it face the room. The sunlight hit it directly, scattering across the walls. The brightness forced them to look, even if just for a second. No one spoke, but I could feel the air tighten. Their silence was not the silence of respect, it was resistance. I set the frame down firmly upright where it belonged. My hands no longer trembled. I could almost hear her voice, steady and calm, reminding me that dignity isn't asked for, it's claimed. The echo of that act lingered in the room, breaking through their chatter. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking into silence. I had placed the past back in its rightful place, and the weight of that choice hung heavy over all of us. That evening, the house smelled of roasted chicken and garlic bread. I had set the table, not grand, just simple plates and silverware laid with care. The photo on the mantel faced the room again, her smile resting above us like a quiet blessing. I thought maybe this meal could bridge the gap, maybe silence could thaw into warmth. But as they gathered, I saw the glances. My daughter-in-law's eyes lingered on the picture, a flicker of irritation passing like a storm cloud. My son sat stiff, scrolling through his phone even as the food steamed before him. The clink of cutlery started, but it was my grandson who broke the hush. He whispered, "Grandma would like this dinner." His small hand reached for the bread, innocent, pure. Then came the sharp voice, "We can't keep pretending, Dad," my son said, laying his phone down with a sigh. "This house, this shrine, this constant reminder, it's too much. People need to move on." His wife added quickly, "And that photo doesn't belong in the middle of everything. It feels outdated." My fork froze in my hand. The candlelight flickered against the glass of her frame, throwing her smile into light and shadow. For a moment I heard her laugh echo in my memory the way she used to set this very table humming as the bread came out of the oven. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of grief and defiance. I spoke slowly, voice rough but steady. She built this table with me. Every meal you've eaten here carried her hands in it. And you tell me it's too much my eyes locked on theirs unblinking. Her presence is not outdated. It is the reason this house even stands. The words dropped like stones and silence followed. The only sound was the tick of the clock and the faint hiss of the candle's flame. My daughter-in-law shifted uncomfortably, my son's jaw tightened, but my grandson looked at me with wide eyes, almost proud. I pressed my palm against the wooden table, the grain rough under my skin, a symbol of years of endurance. I wanted them to feel the weight of that wood the same way I felt the weight of her absence. But they looked away, avoiding both the table and the photo as if both carried truths too heavy for them. The meal went cold, and that silence, untouched, divided not by food but by something deeper. And I knew then that this wasn't about a picture. It was about erasing memory itself. And I would not let them. The night dragged on after that dinner. I sat alone in the living room, the candles melted down to stubs, the photo still standing upright as if daring anyone to touch it again. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that screams, echoing louder than any argument. The sound of the clock ticked in my ears like a hammer each second, a reminder of what had been said. In the hallway I could hear muffled voices. My son's tone, sharp, my daughter-in-law's low and insistent. They didn't know I could hear them. He's clinging to ghosts, she hissed. We'll never move forward if he keeps dragging her into every room. My son sighed. Dad's stubborn, but we can't let him keep controlling everything with a photograph. The words stung more than they should have. Controlling, no. I wasn't holding them hostage. I was holding on to the last shred of her presence, the thread that tied this fractured family together. My hands curled into fists, the old skin tightening until my knuckles cracked. Then a sound broke the heaviness, a small shuffle of feet. My grandson came in clutching his toy car, his pajamas slightly too big, the sleeves dangling over his hands. He looked at me then, at the photo, then whispered, Grandma's still watching, right as innocence cut through the bitterness like sunlight through storm clouds. I leaned down, my voice breaking but firm. Yes, son, she's still here. Every time we sit at this table, every time we speak her name, she's here. My throat ached as the words left me, but I meant them with every part of my soul. Behind me, a floorboard creaked. I turned. My daughter-in-law stood there, arms folded, her eyes cold. This is what I mean, she said, her voice sharp as glass. You're filling his head with false hope. It's not healthy. That photo should stay down. For a moment, rage threatened to take over. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the urge to shout, to break something, to slam my fist on the mantel. But instead, I did something else. I stood tall, shoulders squared, and stepped between her and the picture. The air shifted heavy, the candlelight trembling across the walls. I buried my wife. Once I said, my voice dropping low. Don't you dare ask me to bury her twice. The words hung in the air, trembling unbroken by reply. My grandson's small hand slipped into mine, soft and trembling, anchoring me. And in that fragile silence, I realized the real battle wasn't about the photo itself. It was about respect, about memory, about the line between love and erasure. And I knew this war had only begun. The next morning came with a gray light leaking through the curtains, pale and heavy as if the sky itself shared the burden of my thoughts. I brewed coffee slowly, the hiss of the kettle filling the kitchen with a sound that was more comfort than taste. My hands trembled as I poured, and the steam clouded my glasses. In that haze I caught a reflection of myself, older, smaller, more tired. A man at war in his own home. When I stepped into the living room, the photo was gone. The mantel was bare. For a heartbeat, my chest collapsed in on itself. I searched the shelves, the drawers, the side table. Then I saw it shoved face down in a drawer covered by a stack of unpaid bills. My wife's smile hidden beneath paper debts and careless hands. I pulled the frame out, gently brushed off the dust, and held it against my chest. My pulse thudded like a drum. Each beat was a question, each breath an answer I didn't want to admit. I set the picture back on the mantel this time with 2 candles burning on either side. Their flames flickered defiantly as though the house itself was daring anyone to touch her again. The sound of footsteps came sharp behind me. My daughter-in-law entered arms, crossed, her voice already laced with disdain. "This again, Max, I told you, we don't need that photo looming over every conversation." Something inside me cracked, not like glass shattering, but like wood splitting under pressure. I turned to her, my voice low but shaking. "You think this is about a photo? This is about respect? About memory? About a woman who gave everything for this family, even when it cost her strength and years of her life?" She rolled her eyes, but before she could speak, my grandson peeked from behind her, clutching his toy again. His small voice carried more weight than any adult could muster. "Grandma's here," he whispered, pointing at the photo. The room went still. I looked at her, then at my son, who had followed in silent and uneasy. The candles snapped and hissed, sending shadows crawling up the walls. For the first time, I didn't hold back. I let my words echo heavy and unflinching. "You can turn the photo down. You can hide it in drawers. You can bury it under paper. But you cannot erase her from this house. Not while I'm alive. Not while her grandson remembers her. Not while her blood runs through every one of you." The air was sharp, tense, every breath like a drawn bow. My daughter-in-law's lips pressed into a thin line, her arms tightening across her chest. But no words came. Only silence stretched, long, broken only by the flutter of the flames. And in that silence, I felt the shift, subtle but undeniable. The battle had moved beyond furniture, beyond walls. It was no longer about a frame of wood and glass. It was about a legacy, and I had just drawn the line. The rest of that day carried a silence that clung to the walls like damp air. No one dared to touch the photo again, but I could feel the weight of their disapproval with every glance cast in my direction. That night, as the candles dwindled into soft pools of wax, I sat at the table alone, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. It wasn't the silence that hurt, it was the whispers behind it. The next morning I caught them in the kitchen, my daughter-in-law's voice sharp as a knife against the hum of the refrigerator. "He's clinging to the past. It's pathetic. We need to move forward, not keep staring at some dusty memory." My son's reply was quieter strain. "It's his house. His memories." "You can't," she snapped back. "He thinks respect is measured by keeping old photos around. Respect is money. Security. And he doesn't have either." The words dug deep like salt rubbed into an open wound. I stood by the doorway, hearing each syllable burn into me. My knuckles whitened around the doorframe. My wife's face on that mantelpiece flashed before me, her smile soft, her eyes steady. She had never once equated love with wealth. She had known that true worth was sacrificed time presence. I stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the whispers died instantly. Their eyes darted to me wide-caught. My voice, low but heavy, carried the weight of decades. "You speak of money as if it buys respect. But let me tell you, respect is earned in the quiet hours. In nights at the hospital. In winters when the heat barely worked. In meals stretched so children could eat first. Respect is not in your pockets, it's in your heart. And if you can't see that, then you don't deserve to speak her name." My daughter-in-law's lips parted, but no sound came. My son looked down, shame tugging at his shoulders. Only the hum of the refrigerator filled the air again, a cold mechanical sound against the fire burning in my chest. I turned, not waiting for their answers, and returned to the living room. I lit the candles once more by her photo, their flames rising taller, steadier, like guardians standing watch. In that glow I felt my heart break and mend at once, because I knew this was no longer just about a photo. This was the opening move of a storm that would demand everything from me, and I would give it. By afternoon, the air had shifted. Clouds pressed low over the town, their gray weight seeping into the house. I needed air, So I stepped onto the porch, hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn jacket. That's when I saw Pastor Raymond walking up the path, his Bible tucked under one arm, his old shoes crunching the gravel. "Max," he said softly, climbing the steps. "I thought I'd stop by. Heard things have been unsettled." I opened the door for him. The faint smell of candle wax and old wood filled the living room. His eyes went straight to the photo of my wife, her frame upright, once more flames flickering beside her. He paused, bowed his head, and whispered a prayer under his breath. We sat at the table. The pastor leaned forward, folding his hands, his voice steady but gentle. "A home divided by disrespect cannot stand. I've known you for decades, Max. I know the sacrifices you made, the double shifts at the mill, the winters with cracked hands. Respect should have been the easiest gift your family could give you." His words cut deeper than anger. They were validation, a lifeline when my heart had been drowning. I nodded, but my throat tightened, making it hard to speak. Just then, footsteps came from the hallway. My daughter-in-law appeared, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. "Oh, wonderful," she muttered. "Now you've called in the preacher to shame us." The pastor didn't flinch. He turned, his voice calm, but firm, carrying more weight than thunder. "Child respect is not shame. Turning a photo face down does not erase a life. It only reveals the emptiness of your own heart." For a moment, silence cracked through the room like lightning. I felt it, the echo of her insult broken now by his unwavering truth. She blinked, her confidence faltering, her mouth tightening into a thin line before she spun on her heel and left. I let out a long breath I didn't know I was holding. The pastor put a hand on my shoulder. "Max, storms reveal the roof's strength. Let them test you. In the end, truth will stand taller than pride." As he left, the house seemed quieter, though the storm clouds outside had only thickened. I walked back to the photo, my wife's smile steady as ever. For the first time since that awful moment, I felt less alone. The battle had just begun, but I wasn't fighting it empty-handed anymore. The storm that Pastor Raymond left behind was not of rain, but of silence. That evening the house seemed heavier than usual, the ticking of the old wall clock striking like a hammer against my chest. I lit another candle by the photo, steadying my breath. My wife's smile stared back at me unbroken, and I whispered, "They can try to hide you, but they will never erase you." A knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, Mrs. Callahan, my neighbor of 30 years, stood there with her umbrella dripping. She was small, her back bent with age, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Max," she said, stepping inside, "I saw what happened earlier. I was hanging laundry when I heard the voices. I saw her push that picture down." Her words came out with both pity and outrage. She sat in my kitchen, hands clasped tightly as if holding back years of judgment. "I remember your wife bringing soup when my husband was sick. She was the kind of woman who never turned her back on anyone. To see her disrespected in her own home, Max, it broke my heart." The bitterness in my chest loosened into something heavier. I rubbed my temple, my hands trembling slightly. "What am I supposed to do, Mrs. Callahan?" "They think love is a decoration. Disposable. Replaceable." She leaned closer, her voice lowering, but her words sharp as glass. "Then remind them. Remind them of what you built, what you gave, and what they've chosen to spit on. You're not just a father, Max. You're the living memory of your wife. If they mock you, they mock her. Will you let them?" Her challenge hit me like a spark in dry wood. My heart thudded, echoing her words again and again. I looked across the room to the upright photo. For the first time, anger didn't paralyze me, it pushed me to my feet. Mrs. Callahan's gaze followed me steady, like a witness sworn in before truth itself. "The town remembers who you are, Max, and they'll see who they are too. Don't let them rewrite her legacy." As she left, the door closed with a hush, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried her testimony, her memory, her truth layered onto mine. I pressed my hand against the cold wooden frame of the photo, whispering, "They'll learn, Mary. I'll make sure they do." The night outside roared with wind, but inside something in me had shifted like the first rumble of thunder before a storm's final strike. Morning light crawled through the blinds pale and hesitant, as if even the sun was reluctant to enter a house weighed down by disrespect. I hadn't slept. Mrs. Callahan's words still rang in my ears, each syllable hammering against the walls of my heart. Don't let them rewrite her legacy. By mid-morning, I found myself at the clinic more out of habit than need. Dr. Patel, who had treated Mary through her final months, spotted me in the waiting room. His brow furrowed with the kind of concern reserved for old friends rather than patients. Max, he said, ushering me into his office, you look like you've been carrying more than your share. His voice was calm, but his eyes probed deeper. Tell me. And I did. I told him of the photo turned face down of my daughter-in-law's cutting remark of my son's silence, like a wall between us. As I spoke, my throat tightened, my voice rougher than I intended. She was more than a picture, more than a piece of furniture to be hidden away. Dr. Patel's silence was heavy but not empty. He let me breathe, then placed his hand gently on my arm. Max, when Mary was here, she used to say something every time I asked how she was holding up. Do you remember my chest ached with the memory? She said, as long as Max is steady, I'm steady too. He nodded. She drew her strength from you. You think she'd want you to let anyone diminish that now? No. She'd want you to stand taller, to remind them that what you and she built wasn't just a marriage. It was the foundation of this family. His words cracked something open inside me. Echoes of Mary's laughter, her hand on mine in the hospital, her whispered faith in me. They collided with the image of her face shoved down onto wood. The contrast tore at me, but also ignited me. I stood, my voice firmer now, though my hands trembled. Then I will. I will not let her be buried twice. Dr. Patel's eyes softened, yet behind them glowed approval, the kind a teacher gives a student who has finally remembered the lesson. Good. Because, Max, when you speak, they will listen. Not because you're loud, but because you're true. As I walked out of the clinic, the autumn air cut sharp against my cheeks, carrying the scent of burning leaves. I looked up at the sky, gray but unyielding, and whispered to it as if Mary could hear. I'll carry this truth into the open. I'll make them see. The echo of that vow didn't fade. It beat inside me like a drum calling me forward toward a reckoning that was no longer just about respect, but about restoring the balance of love and memory. The courthouse bell struck noon, each chime hollow and slow, as though it marked the countdown to something heavier than time. I walked the main street, with a folder pressed against my chest, my dark jacket tugged by the wind. For days, the decision had lived inside me, waiting for a moment sharp enough to cut through silence. Now it was here. The air smelled faintly of roasted peanuts from a vendor's cart. Children's laughter carried from the park light against the weight that clung to my steps. I paused in front of the town hall steps, their stone gray and unbending, like judgment itself. The folder in my hands trembled. Inside it, Mary's words lived, her handwriting, her will, her faith in me. When I entered the chamber, the noise of voices hushed. My son sat on the left, his wife beside him, arms crossed like a shield. Her eyes flicked at me with disdain, the same eyes that had dared to turn Mary's photo face down. My grandson sat further down the row, his young face uncertain, his gaze caught between loyalty and longing. I took the center, my voice steady, though my heart raced. This house has forgotten what keeps it standing. I lifted the folder, the papers inside whispering like dry leaves. Respect. Memory. Love. Without these walls, crumble no matter how much money or comfort you line them with. My son shifted, his jaw tightening. His wife scoffed, whispering something sharp under her breath. The sound struck me, but I did not falter. I opened the folder and pulled out the will, the ink bold, the signatures untouched by time. I held it high, so every eye could see. Mary trusted me to keep her truth alive. But when her photo was turned face down and in her own home, it wasn't just a picture dismissed. It was her spirit, her voice, our history. And I cannot allow that. My hand shook, but I pressed it firm against the wood of the podium, feeling its grain dig into my palm. The pain steadied me. This will was written with care, but it can be changed with truth. Respect is not inherited by blood alone. It is earned by the way we honor those who came before us. Gasps echoed when I placed the will flat on the table before the judge. My son leaned forward, his face pale. His wife's fingers clutched at his sleeve as if she could silence the storm I had already unleashed. And then I turned, looking not at them but at my grandson. His eyes widened, a mixture of fear and hope. I spoke directly to him, my voice breaking but strong. The true heir to Mary's love is not the one who mocks her memory. It is the one who remembers, who bows his head even silently to say thank you. The room went still, a silence so deep it rang louder than the bell outside. I pressed my hand against the folder one last time, then let it go, the papers fanning out like wings across the table. In that instant, I felt Mary beside me, and I knew the reckoning had begun. The judge's gavel tapped once, a sound soft but final, like a door clicking shut. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. My son rose, his voice tight with panic. "Dad, you can't be serious. You're throwing away everything for a piece of paper and an old photo." His words scraped against the silence, harsh, desperate. I steadied myself, my hand resting on the table where Mary's will lay open. The grain of the wood pressed into my skin, grounding me. I looked at him then, at his wife, who pulled his arm as if to remind him of the wealth at stake. Her smirk was thin, brittle, betraying the fear behind it. "I am not throwing away," I said, my voice carrying over the room I am restoring. "What you turn face down, I now turn upright." With that, I reached into the folder again and drew out Mary's photograph, the same one they had hidden, the same one that had anchored our home. I lifted it high, its frame catching the light streaming through the courthouse windows. Gasps rose from the benches. The light reflected across Mary's smile, and for a moment she seemed alive again, present in every beam that struck the glass. I set the photo carefully on the podium, facing the audience, refusing to let her memory be silenced. My son's face reddened. He lunged half a step forward, but the judge's gavel cracked down harder this time, halting him. His wife hissed, "He's rewriting everything." Her words echoed like a hiss of steam, sharp, fleeting, already vanishing into the weight of the room. I turned to the benches, to the neighbors, to the townsfolk who had gathered. "You all knew Mary," I declared, my throat tightening but my words steady. "She was kindness itself. She fed those who had nothing even when we ourselves had little. And yet in her own house her photo was flipped down as though she were ashamed to be hidden. Tell me what respect does that earn?" There was silence, then a shifting among the crowd. An old neighbor nodded slowly, whispering Mary deserved better. Another voice agreed, and then another, until the chamber buzzed, not with mockery, but with affirmation. I felt the tide turning, the weight lifting. I pressed the will flat on the table, laid the photo beside it, and said, "Today the page turns. The inheritance will not follow blood-blinded by greed. It will follow the light of memory, the reverence owed to the woman who gave us everything." The judge leaned forward, his glasses sliding low on his nose, studying me with a gaze that weighed truth against pretense. My grandson seated quietly in the back rows without a word. His small hand lifted not in protest, but in salute, his palm pressed over his chest, his head bowed lightly toward the photo. The chamber fell silent again, but this silence was different. Not oppressive, reverent. And in that silence I knew Mary had been restored to her rightful place, no longer face down, but shining upright, as she always deserved. The murmur in the chamber had not yet faded when I drew the envelope closer. Its edges were worn, its seal pressed with the faint imprint of Mary's handwriting, her name curved and delicate. My fingers trembled as I slid it open, the sound of paper tearing loud as thunder in the quiet hall. My son stiffened. "Don't," he barked, his voice cracking. "This isn't necessary." His wife clutched at his sleeve, eyes sharp as glass, her lips pressed into a line that dared me to stop. But I could not. Not now. Not after they had turned Mary's face to the floor. I unfolded the will, each crease unfolding like a buried memory. My voice was slow at first, then steadier, as I read aloud, "To those who honor, respect, and remember, to those who preserve what love has built, my estate shall follow." I paused, the weight of every word cutting through the chamber. Gasps slipped from the crowd. The neighbors leaned forward. My grandson's wide eyes caught the lines as if they belonged to him, as if he alone understood what it meant. She never meant for this, my son snapped, desperation roughening his tone. You twisted her words, Dad. You know I broke in sharper than I had intended. It was your hand that twisted. Her words are clear. Clearer than your mockery, clearer than your greed. I lifted the will higher the paper, catching the same light that shone across Mary's photograph. Two symbols side by side the document, and her face twin pillars of truth that could not be denied. The judge's pen scratched against his ledger, steady and partial. The crowd shifted again, the sound of shoes scuffing wood breaths held tight. Then an old voice rose from the back, trembling but firm. I saw Mary write it. I was there when she sealed it. It was the pastor, his hand raised in solemn affirmation. A hush fell deeper. My son's mouth opened, then closed. His wife turned away, her fingers tightening around her purse strap as though she could pull wealth back into her hands. I pressed the final words into the chamber. With all the strength left in me, this will does not belong to greed. It belongs to memory, to reverence, to the child who carries Mary's light. My eyes found my grandson, and in his small nod I saw the echo of Mary's faith. The hall broke, not with applause yet, but with the crack in the silence that comes before truth swallows every lie. The pastor's words lingered in the air like incense after prayer, undeniable and heavy. I held the will steady in my hand, though inside my chest my heart pounded like a drum. Every eye in that chamber seemed to shift, some with pity, some with admiration, and others, my son's eyes, his wife's glare, with a hatred sharpened by fear. Lies, my daughter-in-law, hissed, her voice brittle, desperate. You planned this. You and that pastor. No piece of paper can erase the years we've given, years of what I asked, my voice cutting across hers. Years of mocking your own mother's memory, of turning her face down as though shame followed her. You gave years, yes, but they were years of contempt. The crowd stirred. Murmurs rolled like waves through the hall. From one corner, the shuffle of a neighbor's chair echoed against the wood floor. Another voice, older, cracked, but firm, I saw it too. I saw her pen those words. It was Mary's nurse, her frail hands folded tight around her purse, her eyes glassy with memory. My son's jaw clenched, his breath sharp. He stepped forward, and for the first time his voice broke. I am her son. How dare you strip me of what is mine? I looked at him not as a judge, not as an accuser, but as a father who had given everything. The words trembled on my tongue, but I forced them out. What was hers is not yours to corrupt. What was hers belongs to love, to honor, to the boy who still knows how to look at her picture without turning away. The boy, my grandson. His small hands clutched the armrest, his knuckles white, his eyes, Mary's eyes, brimmed with tears. He whispered, barely audible, Grandma wouldn't want it this way. The silence broke. It cracked like glass under heat. For a moment every sound collided, the scrape of chairs, the shudder of breath, the mutter of disbelief. Then all eyes turned back to me, to the will that still gleamed under the light, to the truth that no longer hid in shadows. I raised the paper higher, and in that gesture I felt the bridge burn behind me. There was no return, only the path forward through the fire of their anger, toward the justice Mary's memory demanded. The will still trembled in my hand, but not from weakness, from the weight of everything it carried. My daughter-in-law lunged forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. This is fraud. You think you can humiliate us with a piece of paper? We built this house with you. We earned our share. Her words cracked against the oak-paneled walls. But before I could speak, a neighbor rose from his chair. He was old, bent from years of work, his voice gravel yet steady. I watched Max carry lumber on his back while you sat inside with your phone. I saw him patch this roof in the rain while you mocked the truck he drove. Don't speak of earning what you never lifted. The air grew thick. My son's chest heaved, his fists, curling a storm of shame and fury, twisting across his face. You would listen to outsiders over your own blood, he demanded, his voice trembling. I turned, and my eyes caught the light of the framed photo still lying face down on the table. That sight was a blade in my chest, but also a reminder. I bent, lifted it gently, and held it high so all could see. Mary's face, smiling, lit the room with a memory none of them could deny. "This," I said, my voice deep shaking yet unbroken as blood. "This is the woman who bore you, who gave you her years, her breath, her patience. You turned her face to the floor. You spat on what made you. And now you cry for inheritance?" The pastor nodded his hand, pressing the Bible closed as if sealing the truth. The nurse clasped her hands tighter, whispering prayers under her breath. My grandson's eyes widened, shimmering a tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered, "Grandpa." The words rang through me like a bell. In that moment, I felt the echo of Mary's hand on my shoulder, though she was gone. I set the photo down upright this time and laid the will beside it. The two symbols together, her image and her last words, were stronger than any argument. Across the room, voices broke again, some condemning, some supporting, all colliding. The storm was no longer mine alone to bear. The truth had been loosed, and it surged through the room like a fire that could not be called back. The silence after my words was jagged like glass, waiting to shatter. Then at once voices erupted. My son shouted, his hands slamming against the table. "You think you can erase me from her will, from everything we built? I am your blood." His wife's face twisted with rage, her nails clawing at the polished wood as if she could dig her entitlement out of it. But before their fury could swallow the room, the lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. His voice, calm, yet carrying the weight of law, sliced through the uproar. "The testament is clear. Your father holds the authority to honor his wife's wishes, and her wishes written in her own hand stand here in black ink." He tapped the parchment, the sound echoing like a gavel. I watched as my grandson stepped closer, his small hands trembling yet determined. He placed one hand on the frame of Mary's photo, his lips whispering, "She deserves to be seen." His gesture was simple, but it cut deeper than any accusation. My breath caught. I felt the room tilt every angle, sharp with judgment, shame, and truth. I looked at my children, faces flushed with greed, eyes burning with disbelief, and then at the boy who dared to lift what they had cast down. The echo of Mary's voice filled my memory, Max. "It's not the wealth you leave them, it's the lesson." With that, I stood tall, shoulders no longer bowed. I reached for the will, turned it slowly in my hand, then laid it down again, but this time upside down, the ink still visible, the meaning undeniable. A ripple spread through the room. Gasps, curses, and stunned silence collided like thunder rolling across the floorboards. "This house," I said, my voice breaking yet steady, "and what comes with it belongs not to those who spit on her memory, but to the one who still honors her. Blood is not proved by a last name, it is proved by respect." The lawyer nodded his pen, tapping once, as if sealing the verdict. The neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide, some whispering amen. My son staggered back, face pale, his wife clutching his arm with trembling fury. And in the corner, my grandson stood taller than I had ever seen him, his eyes locked on mine as if he knew we had both crossed the threshold of no return. The will had turned, and with it, so had the balance of everything. The room cracked open with chaos. My son lunged forward, his finger stabbing the air in my direction, his voice a storm. "You think this boy deserves what I built with you? What about the years I stood by? What about the sacrifices I made?" His words rattled like coins spilling onto a floor, loud but hollow. His wife's shriek followed, sharp as glass breaking. "This is theft. You can't just strip us down in front of everyone." She clutched his arm, but her eyes burned, not with fear, but calculation, scanning the crowd for allies. The neighbors shifted uneasily, their murmurs swelling and breaking like waves. Some shook their heads, others whispered in sympathy, but most looked toward the photo of Mary now upright, as if she herself were judging. I felt their anger, their spitfire accusations, but I stood still, the will like a weight steadying my hand. My heart pounded, yet each beat grew stronger, not weaker. "Sacrifice," I said, my voice low but cutting. "You speak of sacrifice, then tell me, what did you sacrifice when you turned her memory face down, when you mocked her silence with your laughter? A true sacrifice holds the weight of respect." And you, my son, dropped it like ash. The lawyer raised his hand, but the fury in the air refused to quiet. My son slammed his fist on the table, a sound like a drum of war. My grandson flinched, then straightened again, eyes fixed on me. His small voice rose trembling yet unbroken. Grandpa doesn't owe you anything. Grandma wouldn't want this fighting. She'd want honor. The echo of his words broke something in the crowd. Neighbors began nodding. A pastor murmured a prayer. A retired co-worker muttered the boy's right. The balance shifted, not in law, but in spirit. I turned slowly, meeting every eye, letting the silence stretch, letting the air thicken until every breath felt like judgment. This will is not a curse, I said, my voice rising now firm and unshaken. It is a mirror. And today in this house it shows us all who still carries her light and who has chosen to stand in shadow. The table no longer felt like wood beneath my hands. It was a pulpit, a battlefield, a witness stand. My son recoiled, face red with fury, yet pale with fear. My grandson's hand brushed the frame of Mary's photo, once more steady as a vow. The backlash had come, but it did not drown me. Instead, it revealed what had been hidden all along, that blood alone is not the inheritance. The true heir had already stood up, and the crowd had already seen. The shouting drained from the room like water from a cracked jug. What lingered was heavier than noise, silence thick and unyielding. My son's chest rose and fell, his face twisted with rage, yet no words came. His wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering furiously, but even her sharpness could not cut through the stillness. The lawyer's voice was the first to return, calm, but edged with finality. The will stands as written. His papers rustled, the sound carrying more weight than any argument flung across the table. I shifted my gaze, not at my son, not at his wife, but at the people who had filled this room with their breath and judgment. Their eyes no longer darted nervously. They locked on me, then on the boy who had dared to speak when grown men shouted. In their silence, I read the verdict. My son tried once more, his hand slamming the table again, but this time it landed with less force. The echo faded too quickly, leaving only the creak of the old floorboards beneath our feet. This isn't over, he hissed, but the words fell flat, swallowed by the eyes that no longer believed him. I stood, my palms pressing into the wood, the weight of years and losses steadying me. It is over, I said, my voice a slow toll of a bell. Over because you made it so. You turned her picture down, and in doing so, you turned yourselves away from everything that mattered. Gasps stirred the room, not because of their novelty, but because the truth had been laid bare in front of them. A truth everyone had felt, but none dared to voice. My grandson looked up at me, his small hand still resting on the frame of Mary's photo. In that simple gesture, I saw the chain of memory unbroken, a line that no insult, no greed, no mockery could sever. The neighbors shifted again, but now it was different chairs scraping back heads, bowing slightly, as if an invisible gavel had struck. A nurse who once cared for Mary whispered she'd be proud. A factory foreman, his hands thick with old calluses, muttered that boy deserves it. Their voices built slowly, not loud, but steady, layering together like the bricks of a wall. A wall my son could not climb, no matter how much he raged. I felt the weight lift from my chest, not because the battle was won, but because the truth had finally stood taller than the noise. For the first time since she left this world, I believe Mary's voice was in the room again, not in words, but in the verdict the silence had delivered. And I knew the next act was not to fight further, but to show the world that love once disrespected will choose its own heir. The silence of the verdict did not end the night. It only sharpened its edge. I remained standing, my hands still on the table, while eyes around me shifted no longer at me, but toward my son. The very faces that once nodded with him now looked away, as if ashamed of their earlier agreement. He saw it too. His shoulders stiffened, his lips moved, but the words never formed. His wife clutched his arm, her nails digging in, whispering for him to take control. Yet control had slipped quietly but irrevocably. I turned slightly, my gaze falling on the photo frame my grandson still held upright. The glass glinted against the lamplight, Mary's eyes looking outward, unshaken, unbowed. I felt a surge in my chest, pain, yes, but also clarity. You see, I said, my voice breaking and rising again like a rope strained then tightened. This isn't about money. It's not about what sits in a safe or what name is etched on a deed. It's about whether her memory stands tall or is shoved face down in shame. The neighbors stirred, and one old friend of mine, his back hunched with years of factory work, rose to his feet. "He's right," he said, his voice gravelly. "A man who disrespects his mother's memory disrespects the blood in his own veins." The words rippled outward. A murmur swelled soft at first, then louder. The pastor's wife clasped her hands and whispered, "Lord, keep this house honest." The nurse, her eyes wet, nodded firmly. The will is not just paper, it's a promise. My son slammed his fist one last time, but the sound no longer echoed. It cracked like a weak branch, breaking under its own weight. His wife's face twisted with fury, but she could not drown the tide rising against them. I looked at my grandson, his hand trembling slightly, as he held the photo, and I spoke not to the lawyers, not to the neighbors, but to him. "You held her face up when others turned it down. Remember this night. Remember that love, when defended, outlives every insult." He nodded his small chin, lifting his eyes, reflecting the lamplight like a mirror of hope. Around us, the room had shifted. Those who came to witness now stood taller, their silence no longer empty but filled with judgment, not against me, but against those who had mocked what they should have cherished. In that moment, I felt the current turn. The shame that had been heaped on me now flowed back to its source. And though the will had yet to be read aloud in its finality, the truth had already chosen its heir. The lawyer's voice finally broke through the murmurs, steady as stone carrying the weight of ink and law. By Mary Thompson's last wishes, he began unfolding the document with care. The estate properties and remaining accounts are to be transferred. He paused the silence, drawing every ear closer, not to the eldest son, but to her grandson Eli. Gasps filled the room. My son's face drained of color. His wife's lips parted in a soundless protest. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor as people shifted, some standing, to see clearer. I straightened my hand, still resting on the table, eyes fixed not on the paper, but on the boy clutching the photo. Eli's knuckles were white, his eyes wide as the truth washed over him. "You knew my son," hissed, his voice breaking into a jagged whisper, meant to cut me. "You twisted her against me." I turned to him then, my voice low, steady, carrying not anger but finality. "No, she saw. She saw who turned her face down before the world and who held it up." The lawyer continued reading through the pages, each line a stone laid upon my son's crumbling pride. His wife's hand slipped from his arm. Her glare fell on him, as if his failure now branded her too. The pastor's voice rose soft but clear. "A house divided by disrespect will not stand." His words seemed to echo not only in the rafters, but in the silence of those who once doubted me. My son slammed his fist again, but this time no one flinched. His rage was hollow, and the echo died quickly in the thick air. I drew a slow breath, stepping closer to the center of the room. "This will is not a punishment," I said, my voice breaking through their shame. "It is a mirror. It shows who honored her and who betrayed her." Eli lifted the frame higher, almost unconsciously, the lamplight catching on the glass. The image of his grandmother glowed her eyes, seeming to look out across the room, across the generations. I saw neighbors nod, friends clasp hands, witnesses turning from my son to my grandson. In that moment, the torch had passed not by my hand alone, but by the voice of the woman whose memory they had tried to silence. The room had shifted beyond repair, and I knew the verdict was not only written on paper. It was carved into the very hearts of those who stood as witnesses. The lawyer's voice faded into the air, but the weight of the words clung to every wall of that room. My son slumped into his chair, shoulders, hunched face hidden in his palms. His wife whispered furiously, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You promised me, you promised it was ours." She shoved his arm away, the crack of her betrayal louder than her words. Eli stood frozen, the photo of his grandmother still pressed against his chest. I walked toward him, each step slow, deliberate, the hush of the room broken only by the creak of the old floorboards. The will still lay open on the table, its black letters like iron bars, unbendable, unbreakable. I stopped beside my grandson, placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "This isn't just paper, Eli," I said, my voice firm yet warm. "It's her voice, and it speaks through you now. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, some in awe, others in disbelief. My son shot to his feet, red-eyed, his breath ragged. "This is theft," he cried, his finger jabbing toward me. "You've stolen what's mine." I turned to face him fully, my voice rising, no longer trembling. "What was yours, respect, love, you buried that yourself when you turned her memory face down. Wealth without honor is ashes, and today you hold nothing but ash." The silence after my words was heavy, then fractured by the sound of his wife pushing her chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. She stormed past him, eyes burning, leaving him alone in the center of the gathering. He sank back into his seat, fists clenched, the fire of his rage smothered by the cold truth. I lifted the frame from Eli's hands and turned it outward, holding it high so every eye could see. The light caught her smile, her gentle face watching over us. My voice cracked but carried strong, filling every corner. "She is still here, and she will not be silenced again." The crowd rose to its feet, not in chaos, but in a slow, powerful wave. Applause broke out, first hesitant, then thunderous. It rolled through the hall like a tide, drowning the bitterness, lifting the dignity of the moment higher. Eli's small hand found mine, squeezing tight. His eyes glistened with both pride and fear of the mantle placed upon him. I bent close enough for only him to hear. "You will carry this flame. Protect it, no matter how the winds howl." And in that instant, I knew the legacy had passed. Not by inheritance alone, but by truth revealed under the gaze of every witness. The house had seen disgrace, but it ended in light. The echoes of applause softened into a quiet stillness, as though the very walls had chosen to rest after carrying the storm. I stood with Eli beside me, the frame of his grandmother shining gently in the glow of the late afternoon sun that poured through the tall windows. Dust motes floated in the golden light, turning the air into something sacred. My son sat apart, his shoulders bent, staring into a silence that he himself had carved. No words could mend what pride had broken, and yet in that distance I felt no anger anymore, only the calm certainty that respect cannot be demanded, only lived, only proven. Eli's fingers tightened around mine, a promise unspoken but strong. The murmurs of the neighbors and friends lingered, words like dignity, justice, she would be proud. Their voices wove a blanket over me, not of pity, but of honor. When the crowd thinned and the doors closed, I walked Eli to the small altar in my home. We placed her photo upright, surrounded by the soft light of 2 candles. The room carried the faint scent of melted wax, the quiet crackle of flame, and the beating of our hearts. I lowered myself slowly, knees stiff but steady, and whispered a prayer. Not for wealth, not for recognition, but for strength, that Eli might one day learn the weight of love, not the lure of possessions. That he might remember not just my words, but the silence in which they were spoken. The fire flickered, and for a moment I almost believed she smiled. My chest eased, the heaviness finally lifting. Legacy was not gold, not houses, not cars. It was the courage to defend what is sacred and to stand, even if alone, with dignity unshaken. I turned to Eli, placed the keys of the house in his palm, and said, "Guard it with respect, not with greed. Guard her memory, and one day guard your own." Outside, autumn leaves drifted down, brushing the earth with quiet grace. Life would move on, but the truth had been spoken, sealed by witness and fire alike. Now, dear friends listening to this story, I want to thank you for walking this road with me. Stories like these live not just in words, but in the lessons we carry into our homes, into our families, into our hearts. Take care of your loved ones, honor their memory, and never let respect be turned face down. May health and peace stay with you, and may your families always be blessed with love. Now they know.